When a young delivery worker notices an unsettling change in an elderly customer's behavior, his growing concern leads him to make a fateful decision. What he discovers behind her closed door may not only save her life, but also uncover a hidden loneliness that could have gone unnoticed forever. But will his intervention be enough to bring her back from the edge? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Daniel had grown used to the rhythms of his job. As a delivery worker, he crisscrossed through neighborhoods daily, familiar with the quiet streets, the same houses, and the regular customers. Some days felt longer than others, but he found satisfaction in knowing that he was doing something people depended on. His days often blurred together, one delivery after another, but the people on his route made his job feel a little less mundane. One of his regulars was Mrs. Evelyn, an elderly woman in her late 70s who lived alone. Daniel had been delivering packages to her for as long as he could remember, and over the years they had built a friendly rapport. She was always gracious, greeting him with a warm smile whenever she came to the door. She'd sometimes ask him how his day was going, or offer a comment about the weather, her voice always carrying a soft, grandmotherly tone. Her kindness was a welcome break from the otherwise transactional nature of his job. Today was different, though. As Daniel pulled his truck up to her house, something didn't feel right. He couldn't explain it. It was just a subtle shift in the atmosphere. He grabbed the small package addressed to her and approached her front door, expecting to see the same cheerful face greet him. But when the door opened, the woman standing before him was not the Mrs. Evelyn he remembered. Her face was pale, her hair more unkempt than usual, and there were dark stains on her pants, as though she'd spilled something on herself but hadn't noticed. She smiled faintly, but it was a weak attempt, and her eyes looked distant, unfocused. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Evelyn," Daniel said, handing over the package with his usual politeness. "How are you today?" "Oh, I'm fine, dear," she replied, her voice quivering slightly. "Just a bit tired." Daniel hesitated for a moment, searching her face for signs of what might be wrong. She looked frail, more so than the last time he had seen her, and there was something about the way she carried herself, like she was moving on autopilot, not fully present. The stains on her pants seemed odd, too. Mrs. Evelyn had always been immaculately dressed, even when she was just at home. "You sure everything's all right? You look a bit under the weather," he asked, trying to keep his tone light and conversational, but the concern in his voice was clear. Mrs. Evelyn waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm just getting old, I suppose. Nothing to worry about." Daniel smiled politely, but his mind lingered on her words. He watched as she slowly retreated into her house, moving with the kind of sluggishness that hinted at exhaustion or perhaps something deeper. Before she closed the door, he caught a glimpse inside the house, and for a brief moment he thought he saw something that didn't fit. It wasn't the usual neat and tidy home he'd come to expect. Instead, there was a dimness that filled the space, and the furniture looked slightly disordered, as if it hadn't been touched in days. He shook off the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination. People had bad days, after all. Maybe she wasn't feeling well today, and it was nothing more than that. He walked back to his truck, still carrying a nagging sense of unease, but not entirely sure what to do about it. Mrs. Evelyn had insisted she was fine, and it wasn't his place to pry. As he drove away, the image of her frail form and the dark stains on her pants stayed with him, lingering in the back of his mind. He decided he'd make a mental note to check on her the next time he was in the area. After all, he told himself it was probably nothing. But deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe it was something more. The next day came with its usual deliveries and familiar faces. Daniel moved through his route efficiently, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Mrs. Evelyn. He couldn't shake the image of her pale face, the stains on her clothing, and the way her house had seemed out of order. It gnawed at him, a sense of unease he couldn't fully explain. During his lunch break, he found himself thinking more about her. She was an older woman living alone, and while she had always seemed sprightly, it wasn't unheard of for someone her age to experience sudden health issues. What if those stains had been more than just a spill, What if she was struggling with something, but was too proud or embarrassed to ask for help? He remembered their brief conversation the day before, how she had brushed off his concern with a casual, "I'm just getting old." That phrase stuck with him. It was the kind of thing people said when they didn't want to admit something was wrong, when they were trying to hide their vulnerability. Daniel mulled it over, debating whether he should return to check on her. He wasn't sure if it was his place. After all, he was just the delivery guy. It wasn't like they were close friends and he didn't want to invade her privacy. What if she thought he was overstepping? What if it was just a bad day and she was fine? But then again, what if she wasn't? What if something was seriously wrong and she needed help? He replayed the scene in his mind, over and over, trying to convince himself that it was nothing. Yet each time, the nagging doubt grew stronger. There had been something in her eyes, a distant, almost hollow look that he hadn't seen before. And those stains, he couldn't forget about them. It was a small detail, but it seemed significant in a way he couldn't quite grasp. His shift continued, but the worry never left him. By the time he was nearing the end of his route, Daniel found himself driving past Mrs. Evelyn's house again, even though it wasn't on his schedule for the day. He told himself he was just passing by, but as he neared her home, he slowed down, peering at the house from his truck. The house looked quiet, as it always did. There were no signs of activity, no movement inside that he could see from the street. The curtains were drawn, giving the house a closed-off, almost abandoned feeling. Daniel stopped the truck a little way down the street, turning off the engine and sitting in silence for a moment. He wasn't sure what he was doing there, but something pulled at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. Should he knock on her door again? Would that be intrusive? He sighed, resting his head against the steering wheel for a moment. His mind was full of doubts. What if he was wrong and she was fine? He could be wasting her time, or worse, making her uncomfortable. But on the other hand, what if his gut feeling was right? Taking a deep breath, Daniel made a decision. He would give it a couple of days. If he didn't see any improvement, if things still seemed off, he'd do something about it. For now, he'd let it go. But he couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision. As he started the engine and drove away, he promised himself that he wouldn't ignore his instincts again. Sometimes even a small doubt could mean something bigger. And if Mrs. Evelyn needed help, he'd make sure she got it. 2 days passed, and Daniel's unease had only deepened. He had tried to focus on his work, telling himself that Mrs. Evelyn's situation was probably just a case of an elderly person having a bad day. But the image of her pale face and the stains on her clothing wouldn't leave him. He found himself replaying their last conversation in his mind, searching for clues that he might have missed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much she had seemed off, not just physically, but mentally too. It wasn't just the stains or her disheveled appearance. It was the way she had spoken, the way she seemed distant, almost detached from reality. That morning, as Daniel was getting ready for another day of deliveries, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He resolved to check on Mrs. Evelyn again, even if it meant going out of his way. His gut told him it was the right thing to do. As his route took him closer to her neighborhood, Daniel felt his chest tighten with a mix of anxiety and determination. When he finally turned onto her street, he immediately noticed that her house looked even more forlorn than it had a couple of days ago. The curtains were still drawn, and there were no signs of life. The house, which once had a comforting, lived-in feel, now seemed eerie and isolated, as if it had been abandoned. Daniel parked his truck and stepped out, walking up to the front door with a heavy heart. He knocked lightly at first, then louder when there was no answer. After a few moments of silence, he called out, "Mrs. Evelyn, it's Daniel. I just wanted to check on you, make sure you're all right." No response. He frowned, peering through the small window next to the door. The house was dim, just as it had been the last time he'd seen it. But this time, something else caught his eye, a subtle movement inside. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but he was sure he'd seen a shadow shift in the back of the house. "Mrs. Evelyn?" he called again, louder this time. Still no answer. Daniel's concern was rapidly turning to alarm. He knew something was wrong. His mind raced with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Was she hurt? Had she fallen? What if she had been unable to get to the door? Determined to get some answers, Daniel walked around to the side of the house, hoping to find a window that would give him a better view inside. The side yard was overgrown, weeds and grass creeping up against the house's foundation. As he reached a large window overlooking the living room, he pressed his face against the glass, squinting into the dim interior. That's when he saw her. Mrs. Evelyn was slumped in a chair near the far wall, her head resting against the back of the chair, as if she had fallen asleep. But something about her posture was wrong. Her body looked limp, almost lifeless, and her face was turned away, hidden in shadow. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He knocked on the window, louder this time, trying to get her attention. "Mrs. Evelyn, can you hear me?" Still no response. Panic surged through him. He had to do something. He couldn't just walk away, not when something was clearly wrong. His first instinct was to try the front door again. But then he stopped himself. What if she had locked it from the inside? He didn't want to waste precious time. Without thinking, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. As he waited for the operator to answer, his mind raced. He had never been in a situation like this before. He'd called 911 in emergencies on the road, accidents, fender benders, but this was different. This was personal. He wasn't just calling for a stranger, he was calling for someone he knew, someone he cared about in his own way. 911. What's your emergency? Daniel's voice was shaking as he explained the situation. I'm a delivery worker, and I've been delivering to this elderly woman's house for years. I haven't seen her in a couple of days, and today I found her inside, slumped over in a chair. She's not responding to me. I think something's wrong. The operator's voice was calm, but Daniel could hear the urgency in her tone. What's the address? He gave the address quickly, feeling his pulse quicken as he glanced back toward the window. Mrs. Evelyn hadn't moved an inch. She was still in that same unnerving position, as if she had been frozen in time. Stay on the line with me, the operator instructed. Emergency responders are on their way. Can you tell me if she's breathing? Daniel's stomach twisted at the question. He hadn't even thought to check. His view through the window was limited, and from where he stood, he couldn't see her chest rising and falling. He felt a surge of guilt for not noticing sooner. I can't tell, he stammered. She's too far away, but she's not moving. Stay calm, the operator said. Help is on the way. Minutes passed, though it felt like an eternity. Daniel paced back and forth outside the house, unable to tear his eyes away from the window. He kept hoping, praying that Mrs. Evelyn would suddenly stir, that she would move or give some sign that she was all right. But the longer he waited, the more certain he became that something terrible had happened. Finally, the sound of sirens filled the air, and Daniel's heart leapt in his chest. He rushed to the front of the house as an ambulance pulled up, followed by a police car. Paramedics and officers quickly exited their vehicles, moving toward the house with practiced efficiency. Daniel waved them over, his voice shaky. She's inside, through the window. I think she's unconscious. The paramedics nodded and hurried to the front door. One of the police officers approached Daniel, asking him a few questions about how long it had been since he'd last seen her, while another officer knocked on the door. When there was no response, they made the decision to force the door open. The paramedics rushed inside, and Daniel stood at the edge of the yard, his heart pounding as he watched through the open door. He couldn't see much from where he stood, but he caught glimpses of the paramedics working quickly, moving Mrs. Evelyn onto a stretcher and checking her vitals. Moments later, one of the paramedics emerged, giving Daniel a reassuring nod. She's alive, the paramedic said, but she's severely dehydrated and showing signs of some other medical issues. We're taking her to the hospital now. You did the right thing calling us. Relief washed over Daniel like a wave, and he felt his legs weaken beneath him. He watched as they loaded Mrs. Evelyn into the ambulance, her frail form barely visible beneath the blanket they'd placed over her. For a moment, he thought she might wake up and see him standing there, but she remained still, her eyes closed. As the ambulance pulled away, Daniel stood in the quiet of the now empty yard, his mind racing with emotions, relief, guilt, and a deep sense of responsibility. He had almost ignored his instincts. He had almost walked away, but he hadn't. Mrs. Evelyn was going to be all right, and he couldn't help but feel that, in some small way, he had helped save her life. The night after Mrs. Evelyn was taken to the hospital was a restless one for Daniel. Despite his relief that she had been found in time, his mind couldn't stop replaying the scene. Her frail figure slumped in the chair, unresponsive, the silent house. The fact that she had been in such a condition for days, without anyone knowing, gnawed at him, stirring up emotions he wasn't fully prepared to face. Daniel woke early the next morning, still haunted by the image of her pale, unmoving body. He didn't have any new deliveries to Mrs. Evelyn's house on his route that day, but he couldn't help but wonder how she was doing. Was she recovering? Had they been able to figure out what was wrong? He had so many questions, and the thought of just continuing his day without knowing felt wrong. After a few hours on his route, Daniel decided to take a break. He found a quiet parking spot, pulled out his phone, and dialed the number for the hospital. It took a few transfers and explanations before he was finally connected to someone who could give him an update. Mrs. Evelyn? Yes, she's stable now. She's still being monitored, but she's out of immediate danger, the nurse said in a calm, practiced tone. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thank you, he said, his voice softer now. Do you think I could visit her? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Are you family? Not exactly. I'm the one who called 911. I deliver packages to her house and… Daniel trailed off, not sure how to explain the situation properly. I just want to make sure she's okay. Another pause, this one longer. I see. Well, she doesn't have any close family listed in her records. Let me check with her doctor and see if a visit would be all right. Please hold. The line went quiet, and Daniel found himself staring out of the truck's window, his thoughts racing. No family. He hadn't realized how alone Mrs. Evelyn really was. For some reason, the knowledge made his heart ache. In all their small conversations over the years, she had never mentioned family nearby, but he had always assumed she had someone. Yet, it seemed like she had been entirely on her own. The nurse came back on the line after a few minutes. You're welcome to visit during our regular visiting hours. She's in room 314. Just let the front desk know when you arrive. Thank you so much, Daniel replied, his heart lifting slightly. He ended the call, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Visiting a hospital wasn't something he was accustomed to, and he wasn't sure what to expect. But he knew one thing for sure. He needed to see Mrs. Evelyn. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself standing outside the hospital's entrance, feeling slightly out of place in his delivery uniform. The sterile smell of the hospital hit him as soon as he walked through the sliding doors, and the soft hum of machines and distant voices filled the air. He approached the front desk, where a kind-faced receptionist directed him to the third floor. His stomach churned with nervous energy as he rode the elevator up, each floor passing with a soft ding. By the time he reached the third floor, he was starting to second-guess himself. What would he even say to her? What if she didn't remember him, or worse, didn't want to see him? But before he could turn back, the elevator doors slid open and he stepped into the quiet hallway. Room 314 was just down the hall. Taking a deep breath, Daniel approached the door, feeling a surge of anxiety wash over him. His hand hovered over the door for a moment before he finally knocked gently. A soft voice called from inside, "Come in." He pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. Mrs. Evelyn was lying in a hospital bed, looking even frailer than before, but her eyes were open and she seemed more alert. Her face brightened slightly when she saw him. "Daniel?" she said, her voice weak but recognizable. "I didn't expect to see you here." He smiled, stepping closer to her bedside. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Mrs. Evelyn's eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "I'm doing better now, thanks to you. The doctor said I was severely dehydrated and had some other complications." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "I don't remember much of what happened before I passed out, but I know you saved me. I don't know how to thank you." Daniel shook his head, feeling slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "You don't have to thank me, Mrs. Evelyn. I just did what anyone would do." But even as he said the words, he realized how untrue they were. He had wrestled with doubt, almost convincing himself to walk away. The thought of how easily he could have ignored the signs sent a shiver down his spine. Mrs. Evelyn's gaze shifted toward the window, where the late afternoon sunlight filtered in, casting a warm glow across the room. "I've been alone for so long," she said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. "I didn't think anyone would notice if something happened to me." Her words struck Daniel like a blow to the chest. He had never thought about it like that, how isolation could make someone feel invisible, forgotten. He had always seen Mrs. Evelyn as the kind, chatty woman who greeted him at her door, never realizing the loneliness she carried beneath the surface. "I noticed," Daniel said softly, "and I'm glad I did." She smiled, but it was a sad smile, as though the weight of her isolation had become too much to bear. "I suppose I should have asked for help sooner, but I didn't want to be a burden. It's hard when you've spent your whole life being independent, you know?" Daniel nodded, understanding more than he had expected. "You're not a burden," he said firmly, "and asking for help doesn't make you weak. It just means you're human." Mrs. Evelyn's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she reached out a frail hand, which Daniel gently took. Her grip was weak, but the connection between them was strong, an unspoken understanding that sometimes in life people crossed paths for reasons that they couldn't fully comprehend. "You've been so kind to me, Daniel," she said softly. "I've never had much family, and most of my friends are gone now. But you've always been there, even when I didn't realize how much I needed someone." Daniel's throat tightened with emotion, but he managed to smile. "I'm just glad you're okay." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the soft beeping of the machines the only sound in the room. It was a moment of quiet reflection, where both of them acknowledged the fragility of life and the importance of human connection. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the room, Daniel stood to leave. "I'll come back and check on you soon, Mrs. Evelyn," he promised. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile this time. "I'd like that." As he walked out of the hospital, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. He hadn't just saved Mrs. Evelyn's life, he had also found a deeper understanding of what it meant to care for someone, to truly see them when the rest of the world didn't. It wasn't about being a hero, it was about being present, about listening to that quiet voice inside that urged him to act when something felt wrong. And for that, both he and Mrs. Evelyn were forever changed. The days that followed Daniel's visit to Mrs. Evelyn in the hospital were filled with reflection. He returned to his usual delivery route, but everything seemed different now. The routine he had once found monotonous now felt charged with a new awareness, a deeper understanding of the people he interacted with. He realized that behind every front door there could be a story like Mrs. Evelyn's. It was easy to overlook these details when people seemed to be going about their lives as usual, but now he knew how fragile those appearances could be. Mrs. Evelyn had been released from the hospital after a few more days of observation. Her health was improving, but she still had a long way to go. Daniel had made it a point to visit her regularly, both at the hospital and now that she was back home, though under the care of a visiting nurse. Each time he stopped by, they talked about everything and nothing, the weather, the state of the world, her past, his future. And with each visit, their bond deepened. Daniel found himself drawn to her stories, the little snippets of life she shared, how she had lived through so many changes in the world, how she had seen people come and go. She told him about her late husband, how they had met at a dance hall decades ago. Her eyes lit up when she talked about him, and Daniel could see the ghost of the vibrant, independent woman she had once been. She had outlived many of her friends, her husband, and most of her family. It was no wonder she had begun to fade into isolation. He now understood the deep loneliness she had felt, and how it had crept up on her so silently that even she hadn't realized the extent of it. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after Mrs. Evelyn had returned home, Daniel stopped by to deliver a package. He had grown accustomed to checking in on her, making sure the nurse was taking good care of her and that she was getting stronger. But today, when she opened the door, something was different. Her face looked brighter, and she was dressed in a crisp blouse and slacks, her hair neatly brushed. "Well, don't you look fantastic?" Daniel said, genuinely impressed by the change. "Are you feeling better?" Mrs. Evelyn beamed at him. "Much better, thank you. The nurse has been wonderful, but I think it's the company that's done me the most good." Daniel smiled, feeling warmth spread through him. "I'm glad to hear it. You're looking more like your old self." She laughed softly. "You know, I've been thinking about how lucky I am that you came when you did. If you hadn't been paying attention, I might not be here today." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't one to accept praise easily. It was just instinct, really. "I'm glad I didn't ignore it." "Well, your instincts saved me," she said firmly. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something, Daniel. Ever since I got home, I've been doing a lot of thinking about my life, about how I've been living." She paused, her expression softening. "I realized that I've been letting myself fade away. After my husband died and my friends started passing, I just withdrew. I didn't reach out to anyone, and I didn't want to be a burden. I see now how wrong that was." Daniel listened intently, feeling a swell of emotion in his chest. He had seen this kind of withdrawal in others, but hadn't fully understood it until now. He knew Mrs. Evelyn wasn't alone in her experience. There were so many people like her, quietly suffering in isolation, afraid to ask for help. "I want to change that," she continued, her voice steady. "I don't want to be alone anymore, and I don't mean just with you visiting me, though I've come to look forward to your visits more than you know." She smiled warmly. "I mean, I want to reconnect with the world again. I want to be part of something." Daniel's heart lifted. "That's wonderful, Mrs. Westcott. Evelyn, what can I do to help?" "Well," she said with a twinkle in her eye, "I've decided to take up gardening again. It's something I used to love, and I think it'll give me a reason to be outside, to move around more. But I could use a bit of help getting started." Daniel grinned. "I'd love to help. I'm not much of a gardener, but I can lift things and dig. How's that for a start?" She laughed, the sound light and full of joy. "That's exactly what I need. And maybe, while we're at it, we can plant some flowers that'll make the neighborhood a little brighter." Over the next few weeks, Daniel found himself spending more and more time at Mrs. Evelyn's house, helping her clear the neglected garden and plant new flowers. As they worked side by side, something remarkable happened. Neighbors began to notice. People who had once just passed by started stopping to chat, offering gardening tips, or simply admiring the work being done. Some even brought over seedlings or flowers from their own gardens, eager to contribute to the project. Soon Mrs. Evelyn's garden became a small hub of activity, and she was no longer the quiet, unseen woman in the neighborhood. Her health continued to improve, not just because of the physical activity, but because she had found a renewed sense of purpose. And with that, the isolation that had once gripped her began to dissolve. For Daniel, the experience changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He had started as just a delivery worker doing his job, but now he felt like he was part of something much bigger. He had connected with Mrs. Evelyn in a way that transcended their initial roles, and he had come to understand the profound impact that simple human kindness could have. One evening, after a long day of planting new shrubs in the garden, Mrs. Evelyn sat back in her chair, admiring the work they had done. The once neglected space was now vibrant and full of life, much like Mrs. Evelyn herself. She turned to Daniel, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You know, Daniel," she said quietly, "I used to think that my best days were behind me, but now I feel like I'm getting a second chance. You gave that to me." Daniel smiled, looking out at the garden. "I didn't do much, Mrs. Evelyn. You were the one who decided to start living again." She shook her head. "You did more than you realize. You saw me when no one else did, and that made all the difference." Daniel thought about her words as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the garden. He had always believed that his job was simple: deliver the packages, move on to the next house. But now he understood that sometimes the most important thing you could deliver wasn't a package at all. It was your time, your attention, your willingness to notice when something wasn't right. As they sat there in the fading light, Daniel realized that this was more than just the end of a chapter in his life. It was the beginning of something new. He had found a deeper sense of purpose, one that went beyond the routine of his job. He had found a connection, a reason to care. And in that moment, with the scent of fresh flowers in the air and Mrs. Evelyn smiling beside him, Daniel knew that the simple act of caring had not only saved her life, it had enriched his own. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.